A black man stepped out of the bar that evening, the echoes of laughter and conversation still buzzing behind him. He had just finished a meeting with friends, the kind of evening that was supposed to end with a simple drive home. But as he made his way toward his car, a police cruiser pulled up, its siren flashing in the distance. For a brief moment, he hesitated, wondering if it was just a routine check, or if they were responding to something else nearby. He had done nothing wrong, there was no reason to be nervous. At least, that's what he thought. The officer stepped out of the car, a sense of authority dripping off him, like he had already made up his mind about how this night would end. "Hey, you! What are you doing here?" The officer's voice was loud, aggressive, with a tone that made it clear there was no friendly conversation coming. "I'm just heading home," the man replied, calm and measured. He kept his hands visible, knowing exactly what he had to do to avoid trouble. But it didn't matter. "Is that so?" the officer sneered, stepping closer, invading his space. "I don't think I've seen you around here before." There was a hint of a smirk on his face, as if this was a game he had played many times before, and he already knew the rules. "You're looking a little too comfortable for my liking." The man's heart began to pound. He could feel the tension thickening, but he stood his ground. "I don't want any trouble, officer. I'm just going to my car." But before he could take another step, the officer's hand shot out, grabbing him by the arm. "You don't get to walk away when I'm talking to you," the officer spat, his grip tightening. "You're going to stand right here and show me your ID, and maybe I'll let you go without locking you up tonight." The man knew he had a choice: comply and hope this ended soon, or resist and face the consequences. He slowly reached for his wallet, trying to keep his movements deliberate, non-threatening. But the moment he pulled out his ID, the officer snatched it from his hand and looked it over with a cruel smile. "Ha! So you think you're someone important," he said, scanning the ID before flicking it back at the man, almost daring him to catch it. "Well, let me tell you something. Out here, you're nobody." There was a pause, a moment where the man could feel the weight of those words pressing down on him. Nobody. It was a word that burned, a word that was meant to strip away his dignity, to reduce him to nothing more than a target for this officer's prejudice. He felt the heat rise in his chest, but he said nothing. What could he say? There was no way to reason with a man who had already decided he was guilty of something, even if it was just existing in a space that this officer felt he didn't belong. But the officer wasn't done. "You're gonna learn a lesson tonight," he said, stepping closer, his voice low and menacing. "People like you don't get to just walk around like they own the place. You think just because you're wearing a nice suit, you're better than everyone else. That you're gonna get special treatment. I'm not looking for any special treatment," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper, trying to stay calm. "I just want to go home." But the officer wasn't listening. He grabbed the man's arm again, rougher this time, and shoved him against the car. "I don't care what you want. You're gonna get what I give you." The next few minutes were a blur of humiliation and rage. The officer forced him to the ground, cuffing him tightly, ignoring the man's protests. People were beginning to gather, watching, some with their phones out, but nobody stepped forward. Nobody said a word. And as he lay there, his face pressed against the cold pavement, all he could hear was the officer's voice, mocking him, degrading him. "You don't belong here. You never did." The man was eventually dragged to his feet and pushed into the back of the police car, his head spinning, not from any physical injury, but from the sheer disbelief of what was happening. He had always known the world was unjust, but never had he felt its weight so personally, so brutally. And all because of the color of his skin. Hours later, he was released, no charges, no explanation, just a bruised body and a shattered sense of dignity. But the story was far from over. What the officer didn't know, what he could never have imagined, was who he had just attacked. Because this man wasn't just anyone. He wasn't that nobody the officer had tried to make him out to be. He was the one person who had the power to change everything for that officer, to turn the tables in a way that no one could have predicted. A few days later, the officer was back at his usual beat, smug, confident, as if nothing had happened. He even bragged about it to his colleagues, laughing at how he'd put another troublemaker in his place. That's when he got the call, the one that would change everything. "You need to report to the courthouse," his supervisor said, not giving much detail. "There's someone you need to meet." Confused, but not particularly concerned, the officer made his way to the courthouse, thinking it was just another routine hearing, maybe some small case where he had to testify. But when he walked into the courtroom, his heart skipped a beat. Because there, behind the bench, dressed in robes and looking directly at him, was the man he had humiliated just days ago. The judge. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, a cold rush of panic that made him wish he could turn back time, erase everything that had happened. The man's eyes were calm, but there was a fire behind them, a quiet, burning rage that said everything his lips didn't need to. "Officer," he began, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom, "it seems you and I have unfinished business." The officer's face drained of color as the weight of the situation began to settle in. He had made a grave mistake, one that was now unfolding in front of him, and there was no way out. The tables had turned, and now he was the one who would have to answer for his actions. But what would happen next? How would justice be served? And what would be the fate of the man who thought he could get away with using his badge to belittle and control others? Stay with us as we unravel this story of power, prejudice, and unexpected twists. Because sometimes, the tables don't just turn, they flip, and when they do, the impact is felt by everyone around. Hey everyone, before we dive into today's story, I want to take a moment to address something important. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism in all its forms. We know the struggles and pain that come with facing discrimination, and we want you to know that you're not alone. This channel is about powerful stories, and some of them tackle real, painful truths, but always with the hope of justice and change. So, thank you for being here, and we hope this story speaks to you. If you enjoy our content, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you never miss a new twist. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Charlotte, North Carolina was a city of contrasts. On one side, sleek skyscrapers and bustling businesses painted a picture of modern success and progress. But beneath that polished surface, there were cracks that revealed the same old struggles that had existed for decades. There were communities that felt overlooked, unseen, and constantly judged. For many, the city's promise of opportunity was something they still fought to grasp, struggling against forces that tried to push them back down. Malik Thompson was a man who understood those struggles better than most. At 42 years old, he had spent years working his way up, determined to make something of himself despite the odds. He had grown up on the south side of Charlotte, in a neighborhood where opportunities didn't come knocking unless you broke down the door to find them. He knew what it was like to be underestimated, to have people make assumptions about who you were just by looking at you. That's why he had decided to pursue law, to fight for people who didn't have the voice or the power to fight for themselves. His rise to becoming a judge hadn't been easy. It was marked by long nights studying after working 2 jobs, moments of doubt, and countless obstacles placed by those who didn't want to see him succeed. But Malik's determination was unyielding. He knew the system was flawed, he had seen it from every angle. Yet, he also believed in justice. He believed that if he could just get his foot in the door, he could start to make a difference, even if it was just one case at a time. Standing at 6 feet tall, with a composed demeanor and a voice that commanded attention without ever needing to shout, Malik had a presence that filled any room he walked into. His colleagues admired him for his fairness and integrity, even if they didn't always understand his approach. To them, he was the judge who didn't play favorites, who saw beyond the biases that clouded so many others' judgment. But to the communities who often felt voiceless, Malik was a symbol of hope, a reminder that someone was fighting for them, even when they weren't there to see it. That night, when Malik had finished his drink at the local bar and stepped out into the evening air, he felt a rare sense of peace. It had been a long week, filled with difficult cases and difficult decisions, but this was his moment to unwind, to breathe. He was a regular there, known to the bartenders and to the few friends he'd catch up with over the occasional beer. He liked the feeling of blending in, of just being another guy at the end of the bar after a long day. But as he made his way across the parking lot to his car, that sense of peace was shattered. Malik noticed the police cruiser slowly approaching, its headlights illuminating his path. He paused, waiting to see if it would drive past, but it stopped, the engine humming, almost as if it was waiting for him. The officer stepped out, adjusting his belt, and Malik could see the casual arrogance in the way he moved. This wasn't a routine check, he could sense it. This was something else, something far more personal. Officer Tim Collins was everything Malik had spent his life fighting against. Tim was in his mid-30s, with a face that carried a perpetual smirk, as if he was always in on a joke that no one else understood. He had been with the Charlotte Police Department for over a decade, and his record was spotless, at least on paper. He knew how to work the system, how to cover his tracks, and he had friends in high places who made sure that any complaints against him never stuck. To his colleagues, Tim was a dependable cop, the kind of guy you'd want by your side during a tough arrest. But to those who had the misfortune of crossing his path on a bad night, he was a bully with a badge. He had grown up in a small, insular community on the outskirts of Charlotte, and his views on race and authority had never evolved beyond what he was taught as a child. He didn't see people, he saw problems, and he was convinced that he knew how to solve them. So when he saw Malik in the parking lot that night, alone, dressed sharply, and carrying himself with a confidence that Tim found almost offensive, he made a quick decision. He didn't care who this man was, he just saw someone who didn't belong, someone who needed to be reminded of his place. "Hey, you! Hold up a second," Tim called out, already reaching for the flashlight clipped to his belt. He shined it directly in Malik's face, as if he was trying to erase the man's sense of dignity with that single beam of light. Malik squinted against the brightness, raising a hand to shield his eyes. "Can I help you, officer?" he said, his voice calm, though he could feel his pulse quickening. He had faced situations like this before, but it never got easier. He knew what it meant to stay calm, to keep his voice level, to make no sudden movements. Tim took a step closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone flat, but with an undercurrent of hostility. "I'm just heading home," Malik replied, trying to read the situation, to figure out how far this would go. "Is there a problem?" Tim's smirk widened, as if Malik's attempt to defuse the situation was exactly what he wanted to see. "Yeah, there's a problem. You're out here, looking like you think you own the place." He stepped even closer, invading Malik's space, daring him to push back. "Why don't you show me some ID?" Malik hesitated, not because he had anything to hide, but because he knew that whatever he did next would determine how this interaction played out. He could feel the old anger rising, the anger that had driven him to study law in the first place. But he pushed it down, took a breath, and slowly reached for his wallet. Tim snatched the ID from Malik's hand, barely glancing at it before tossing it back. "Malik Thompson, huh? Fancy name. What, you some kind of lawyer or something?" "I'm a judge," Malik said, his voice steady, even as the humiliation of the moment threatened to overwhelm him. Tim's eyes flickered, just for a moment, before he forced the smirk back onto his face. "A judge, huh? Well, that's funny, because right now, you're just another guy who needs to learn some respect." And with that, he shoved Malik against the side of the car, his hands moving quickly, roughly, as he cuffed him. Malik could hear the faint sound of laughter from inside the bar, people unaware of what was happening outside, just feet away. He could feel the sting of the metal biting into his wrists, and the sharp, searing anger that came with being reduced to nothing more than another target, another nobody, in the eyes of this man who thought his badge made him untouchable. But Malik was no nobody. Not anymore. And even as Tim forced him into the back of the cruiser, Malik's mind was already working, already thinking of what would happen next, of what he could do to make sure that this moment would not be forgotten, not by him, and certainly not by Tim Collins. Because this time, there would be consequences. This time, there would be a reckoning. The morning after the incident, Malik sat at his kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him. The events of the previous night played over and over in his mind, each detail as vivid as if it was still happening. The parking lot. The cold metal of the handcuffs. Tim Collins' mocking grin. Malik had seen abuse of power countless times in his career, but experiencing it firsthand, especially after everything he had accomplished, felt like a punch to the gut. It was more than humiliation, it was a reminder of how far there was still to go, even for someone like him. Across town, Officer Tim Collins was starting his shift, still riding the high of what he considered a job well done. To him, last night had been routine, just another way of maintaining control, reminding people like Malik who really ran things around here. As he slid into his patrol car, he didn't think twice about it. He had already bragged to a couple of his colleagues about putting a cocky suit in his place, chuckling at the memory of the moment Malik had told him he was a judge. "Can you believe that?" Tim had said, recounting the story over coffee. "He said it like I should care. Like it mattered." His partner, a younger officer still trying to fit in, had laughed along, though there was a nervous edge to it, as if even he wasn't sure how to react. But Tim thrived on that reaction, the discomfort, the uncertainty. It made him feel powerful. Malik, however, was done feeling powerless. He wasn't a man who sought out revenge, but he knew he couldn't let this slide. He had seen what happened when people stayed silent, how one unchecked act of abuse could lead to another. This time, he had the power to act, and he intended to use it. He had connections, colleagues who would listen, and he knew how to work the system just as well, if not better, than Tim Collins thought he did. That afternoon, Malik made a call to his closest friend, Alex, a seasoned attorney who had been by his side through thick and thin. "I need your help," Malik said, his voice measured but carrying a weight that made Alex sit up straight in his chair. "What happened?" Alex asked, already sensing that this was serious. Malik took a breath. "I was detained last night. By a cop named Tim Collins. He assaulted me, cuffed me, humiliated me in public. I need to take action, but I want to do it the right way." There was a pause on the other end of the line as Alex processed the information. "Malik, you're a judge. Why would he?" The shock was evident in his voice. "He didn't know," Malik replied, a faint, ironic smile tugging at his lips. "To him, I was just another black man who didn't belong." Alex was quiet for a moment, then his tone changed, becoming more focused, sharper. "All right. Let's make sure this doesn't go unanswered. We'll file a formal complaint, and I'll start gathering information on Collins. If he's done this to you, he's probably done it to others." Malik nodded, even though Alex couldn't see him. "That's what I'm counting on." Over the next few days, Alex worked tirelessly, digging into Tim Collins' past. What he found wasn't surprising to Malik, but it was disturbing. There were whispers of complaints that had been filed but quietly dismissed, stories of aggressive behavior, and a pattern that suggested last night wasn't an isolated incident. Malik knew this would be a long fight, but he was prepared for it. He had to be. Meanwhile, Tim's life continued as if nothing had happened. He patrolled the streets, cracking jokes with other officers, and never once suspected that the man he had detained was quietly building a case against him. That was, until the official summons arrived. It was a typical Friday afternoon when Tim's supervisor, Captain Reynolds, called him into the office. Tim walked in, expecting the usual small talk or maybe a briefing on some upcoming event. Instead, he found Captain Reynolds seated at his desk, his expression serious, a thick manila envelope in his hand. "Close the door, Tim," Reynolds said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Tim's smirk faltered as he did as he was told, the room suddenly feeling much smaller. "What's going on, Cap?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Reynolds slid the envelope across the desk. "We need to talk about an incident that occurred earlier this week. It's about a man you detained in a parking lot. Malik Thompson." Tim's heart skipped a beat at the name. He hadn't thought about Malik since that night, but hearing the name now, in this context, sent a jolt of unease through him. "Yeah, I remember." "What about it?" he said, trying to sound nonchalant. "He's filed a formal complaint," Reynolds said, his eyes locking onto Tim's. "And he's not just anybody. He's Judge Malik Thompson." The words hit Tim like a punch to the gut. "Judge?" For a moment, he couldn't speak, his mind racing to catch up. "Judge," he repeated, almost in disbelief. "Are you kidding me?" "No, I'm not," Reynolds said flatly. "And this is serious, Tim. There's going to be an investigation. They're already looking into your conduct, not just from that night, but from your entire career. If there's anything you haven't been telling us, you'd better speak up now." Tim could feel the walls closing in, but he wasn't about to admit defeat. "Not yet." "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising slightly. "He's just trying to make a scene because he didn't get his way. I did my job." He was being uncooperative. Reynolds didn't blink. "That's not how it looks, Tim. There are witnesses, and there's footage. You know how this works. If they find anything, they'll make an example out of you. I suggest you get yourself a lawyer." Tim stormed out of the office, his mind a chaotic mess of anger, fear, and confusion. How could this be happening? How could one bad night turn into this nightmare? As he drove home, his grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. This wasn't supposed to happen. People like Malik weren't supposed to fight back, let alone have the power to strike back. That weekend, Malik attended a community event in the very neighborhood where he had grown up. He was greeted warmly by people who knew him, who respected him. But beneath the smiles and handshakes, there was an undercurrent of tension. People had heard whispers about what had happened, and they were waiting to see what Malik would do. One of the local activists, a woman named Shonda, approached Malik, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "We heard about what happened, Malik," she said quietly. "And if you're planning to take this to court, we're with you. This isn't just about you. It's about all of us." Malik met her gaze, and for a moment, he felt the full weight of the responsibility he had taken on. But he also felt something else, resolve. "I know," he said. "And I promise you, this isn't over." As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows over the streets of Charlotte, the tension in the air was palpable. Tim was scrambling, trying to find a way to cover his tracks, while Malik was preparing for a battle he had been fighting his whole life. Both men were bracing for what was to come, but only one of them knew just how far this would go. Because the next time they would meet, it wouldn't be on the street. It would be in a courtroom, where the stakes were higher, and the consequences much more severe. And Tim Collins had no idea just how much he stood to lose. The courthouse was unusually quiet that morning. The sun barely peeked through the thick, gray clouds, casting a muted light over the stone facade of the building. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Everyone knew today's hearing wasn't just another case. It was a clash, a reckoning, and nobody could predict exactly how it would unfold. The hallway leading to the courtroom was lined with reporters, community members, and curious onlookers. Whispers echoed off the marble walls, each one carrying a different version of the same story. Officer Tim Collins was about to face the man he had wronged, not as a defendant, but as an adversary who was no longer silent. Malik arrived early, dressed in his usual, understated suit, his expression calm, almost serene. As he made his way through the hallway, people parted, some offering quiet nods of encouragement, others just watching, trying to read his face for clues about what would happen next. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone spoke volumes. He was ready, and he wasn't backing down. He had waited for this day, prepared for it, and now that it was here, he felt a quiet, controlled fire within him. Across the hall, Tim Collins was pacing near the courtroom entrance, his lawyer by his side, speaking in hushed tones. Tim looked different today, the usual arrogance absent from his posture. There was a stiffness in his movements, a tension that he couldn't shake. He had spent the last few nights in a panic, scrambling to find any way to undermine the complaint Malik had filed. But each attempt had failed, leaving him with no choice but to face the consequences head-on. "Relax, Tim," his lawyer said, trying to project a calm he didn't quite feel. "We've got a strategy. Just stick to the script. You were doing your job, and that's all there is to it." Tim nodded, but he couldn't help glancing across the hall, catching a glimpse of Malik as he spoke quietly with a few of his colleagues. He felt a chill run down his spine. How had it come to this? All he had done was put another guy in his place. He had done it 100 times before, and nothing had ever come of it. But this time was different. This time, his victim wasn't staying silent, and that changed everything. The courtroom was packed by the time the session began. Malik took his place, seated with a composed, almost stoic demeanor, while Tim sat at the defense table, his hands clenched together. The judge overseeing the case, a stern, middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, called the court to order, her gavel striking with a sharp crack that silenced the murmurs in the room. As the proceedings began, Tim's lawyer launched into a rehearsed defense, painting the incident as a misunderstanding, a routine check that had been blown out of proportion. Officer Collins was merely following protocol, he argued, his voice smooth, almost soothing. There was no malicious intent, no deliberate act of discrimination. It was a regrettable situation, but one that should be viewed in the context of maintaining public safety. Malik listened, his face impassive, but his eyes sharp, catching every word. When it was his turn to speak, he stood, facing the court, and there was a momentary hush as all eyes turned to him. "I'm not here to argue about protocol," he began, his voice steady, resonant. "I'm here because I was treated like a criminal without cause, because I was humiliated and degraded in public, not for what I did, but for who I am. And I'm not the only one. This isn't about one bad night. It's about a pattern, a culture of abuse that's gone unchecked for too long." Tim shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, and he hated it. He had always been the one in control, the one who made others squirm, but now he was the one on the spot, exposed and vulnerable. The evidence began to unfold, bit by bit, piece by piece. Alex had done his job well, compiling footage, witness statements, and even records of previous complaints that had been buried. As each new piece was presented, Tim's confidence eroded, replaced by a growing sense of dread. He could see the narrative shifting, see the way people in the courtroom were looking at him now, not as a law enforcer, but as a bully who had been caught. Then came the testimonies. Malik's was first, and as he spoke, the room was silent, every word hanging in the air like a weight. "I wasn't approached as a citizen," Malik said, his voice clear, unwavering. "I was approached as a target. Officer Collins didn't see me as a man, he saw me as a problem that needed to be handled. He didn't ask questions, he didn't listen, he assumed, and he acted on that assumption. That's not policing. That's prejudice." There was a brief pause before Tim's lawyer rose, attempting to dismantle Malik's testimony. "You claim to have been targeted, Judge Thompson, but isn't it possible that Officer Collins was simply doing his job? Isn't it possible that you misunderstood his intentions?" Malik turned slightly, his eyes locking onto Tim, and for a moment, the room felt smaller, the air heavier. "No," he said softly, but firmly. "I didn't misunderstand anything. I know exactly what I experienced. And I know what it feels like to be judged before you've even spoken a word. That's what happened that night, and that's what happens to so many others who don't have the privilege of standing in this courtroom and speaking out. But today, I do, and I'm going to use that voice. The room was still, the tension almost tangible. The judge allowed a short recess, and as people filed out of the courtroom, Tim remained seated, staring at the table, his mind racing. This was slipping out of his control faster than he had imagined, and he didn't know how to stop it. During the break, Malik stepped outside for a moment of air, and found himself approached by a young man, probably in his early 20s. The man hesitated, then spoke, his voice shaky but earnest. "Judge Thompson. I just wanted to say thank you. I've been through something like this, but I was too scared to do anything. Seeing you stand up there, it means a lot." Malik's expression softened. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the courage it took to share that. "You're not alone," he said quietly. "And you deserve to be heard. Remember that." As the session resumed, it was Tim's turn to take the stand. The lawyer tried to coach him, to guide him through a rehearsed defense, but Tim was unraveling, the cracks in his composure widening with every passing minute. When the prosecutor began questioning him, those cracks split wide open. "You've been a police officer for over a decade, Mr. Collins," the prosecutor began, his tone calm, methodical. "In that time, how many complaints have been filed against you for excessive force?" Tim hesitated, glancing at his lawyer, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "A few," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "But they were all dismissed." "Dismissed, or buried?" the prosecutor pressed, stepping closer, his voice rising slightly. "Isn't it true that several of those complaints were settled out of court, with non-disclosure agreements to prevent the details from becoming public?" Tim's face reddened, a mix of anger and embarrassment. That's not my fault. I was doing my job. People don't like cops, they complain. That's just how it is." "Is that how you justify what happened in that parking lot?" the prosecutor asked, his tone sharp, cutting through the excuses. "You treated Mr. Thompson not as a citizen, but as a threat. You humiliated him, cuffed him, and ignored his rights, all because you assumed he didn't belong. Do you still believe you were just doing your job?" Tim opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room, and for once, he was at a loss. Then, from the back of the room, a voice spoke, loud and clear. He wasn't protecting anyone. He was protecting himself. The room turned, eyes searching for the source, and there, standing near the doorway, was a man who had been quietly observing the trial. He was one of Tim's former colleagues, someone who had kept silent for years, but now felt compelled to speak. "Collins has been getting away with this for years," the man said, his voice shaking slightly, but growing stronger with every word. "We all knew it. We saw it, but nobody wanted to say anything, because we were afraid. Afraid of what would happen if we did. But seeing Malik stand up there, I can't stay quiet anymore." A murmur rippled through the room, a wave of shock and disbelief. Tim turned, his face a mix of fear and fury. You're lying," he shouted, his voice desperate, but the damage was done. The judge called for order, but the truth was already out, hanging in the air like a storm cloud, ready to break. Malik watched, his expression unreadable, but inside, he felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. This wasn't how he wanted justice to be served, but maybe, just maybe, this would be the beginning of something different. The trial wasn't over yet, but the balance had shifted, and everyone in that room could feel it. Tim had always believed he was untouchable, but now he was facing the consequences of his actions, and there was no escaping them. The question wasn't if he would be held accountable, but how far the consequences would reach. And as the gavel struck, signaling another recess, the tension lingered, unresolved, promising a conclusion that nobody could predict, but everyone was desperate to see. The courtroom buzzed with whispers and murmurs as people returned to their seats, the echoes of the unexpected testimony still lingering in the air. It was rare for an officer to break the unspoken code of silence, rarer still for them to do it in a room full of people, with the eyes of the media watching every move. But there it was, an admission that threatened to tear down the wall of defense Tim Collins had been trying to build. Malik sat quietly, his hands folded, watching as the chaos simmered. This was not how he had expected the trial to unfold, but he understood the gravity of what had just happened. It was as if a dam had burst, and the truth was spilling out, unable to be contained any longer. He looked over at Tim, who was slumped in his seat, staring blankly at the table in front of him, his once smug demeanor shattered. For the first time, Malik could see fear in his eyes. As the judge regained control of the room, she called the court back to order, her voice firm, commanding. "This court will not tolerate outbursts," she said, her gaze sweeping over the room. "However, given the nature of the statement, I am allowing a brief recess to assess the relevance of the testimony provided." She looked down at Tim's former colleague. "Sir, if you are willing to testify under oath, please approach the bench." The man hesitated, as if weighing the consequences of his actions, but then slowly stepped forward. The entire room watched, breathless, as he made his way to the stand. Tim's lawyer immediately objected, but the judge silenced him with a wave of her hand. "We will hear what he has to say," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Malik could feel the tension tightening around them, like a coil ready to snap. This was it, the moment that could change everything. He leaned back slightly, letting out a quiet breath, and prepared to listen. The prosecutor wasted no time. "Please state your name and your relationship to Officer Collins," he said, his voice measured, yet piercing. "My name is Daniel Price," the man began, his voice a bit shaky but growing stronger. "I used to work alongside Tim Collins as a patrol officer. We were partners for over 3 years. Officer Price," the prosecutor continued, "earlier, you mentioned that Officer Collins had been getting away with this for years. Can you elaborate on what you meant by that?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes flicking nervously towards Tim. "I mean, he has a history of treating people unfairly. Specifically, people of color. I'm not saying he's done it every time, but it happened enough that we all knew it wasn't right. He would target them, intimidate them, sometimes even provoke situations just to get a reaction. And he paused, swallowing hard, we just went along with it." There was a collective intake of breath from the audience, a ripple of shock that spread across the room. Tim's jaw clenched, and he shot Daniel a look that was equal parts disbelief and betrayal. "Why are you doing this?" Tim muttered, barely loud enough for those around him to hear. "We were partners." Daniel met his gaze, and there was a sadness in his eyes, a regret that seemed to weigh down his every word. "Because it's the truth, Tim. And I can't keep pretending it didn't happen." The prosecutor stepped forward, pressing the moment. "So you're saying that Officer Collins has a pattern of racially biased behavior? That what happened to Judge Thompson was not an isolated incident?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes. That's exactly what I'm saying." Tim's lawyer quickly stood up, his face flushed. "Objection. This is hearsay and character assassination. This man's testimony should be dismissed unless he has concrete evidence to back these claims." The judge considered for a moment, then turned to Daniel. "Officer Price, can you provide any evidence to support your statements?" Daniel hesitated, and for a second, it looked like he might back down. But then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, black USB drive. "I have recordings," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "From our patrol car. Some of them were things Tim said when he didn't know the camera was still on." Tim's face went pale, the blood draining as he realized what was about to happen. You can't do this," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and fear. "You're throwing me under the bus." "No, Tim," Daniel said softly, shaking his head. "You threw yourself under the bus the moment you decided that badge gave you the right to treat people like that. I'm just telling the truth." The judge allowed the recording to be played, and as the first audio clip began, the room fell deathly silent. It was a conversation between Tim and another officer, casual and offhand, but the words were cutting, dripping with disdain. "You see that guy back there? Bet he thinks he's so smart, just because he's got a nice car. I can make him sweat. Watch." As the recordings continued, the audio revealed a pattern of similar comments, disparaging remarks, subtle threats, even admissions of provoking situations just to justify an arrest. Each clip seemed to peel back another layer, exposing the toxic mindset that had gone unchecked for so long. The room was still, the only sound the faint hum of the audio as it played. Tim could barely breathe, his hands shaking, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He felt exposed, stripped bare, every carefully constructed lie crumbling before his eyes. This wasn't just an accusation now, this was evidence, cold and undeniable. When the audio stopped, there was a pause, a moment where nobody seemed to know what to say. Then the prosecutor turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I believe it's clear that this is not about one isolated incident. Officer Collins has shown a consistent pattern of behavior that is not only unprofessional but criminal. I ask that the court take this into consideration as we proceed." Tim's lawyer scrambled to respond, but it was clear that the momentum had shifted, and there was no stopping it. The judge nodded, her expression stern. "We will take a short recess before proceeding with closing arguments." As people filed out, Malik remained seated, watching Tim closely. For years, he had seen men like Tim operate with impunity, hiding behind their badges and their authority. But now, for once, there was no shield, no protection. Tim was vulnerable, laid bare before everyone, and Malik could see the fear in his eyes. Tim couldn't take it anymore. He stormed out of the courtroom, his breathing ragged, his hands clenched into fists. Malik stood up, following him out, and caught up with him just as he reached the hallway. "Tim," Malik called out, his voice firm, but not unkind. Tim turned, his eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and desperation. "What do you want?" Tim snapped, his voice breaking. "To gloat? To watch me fall apart? Well, congratulations, you got what you wanted." Malik took a step closer, his expression serious. "No, Tim. That's not what I want. I want you to understand. I want you to see what you've done, not just to me, but to every person you treated like they didn't matter." Tim laughed bitterly, but there was no joy in it, only pain. "You don't understand. I was just doing my job." "No," Malik said, his voice cutting through the noise, calm but powerful. "Your job was to protect people. All people. But you chose to protect your ego instead. You let your prejudice decide who deserved respect and who didn't, and that's why we're here." For a moment, Tim looked like he might argue, but then he faltered, his shoulders slumping. "I never thought it would come to this," he whispered, almost to himself. I thought I was in control." Malik nodded, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "That's the problem, Tim. You thought you were above everyone else, that the rules didn't apply to you. But today, you're learning that there are consequences. Not just for me, but for every person you've hurt." Tim looked down, his fists unclenching, as if the weight of his actions was finally starting to settle on him. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Malik didn't have an easy answer. "That's for the court to decide. But whatever happens, it's time for you to face it. No more hiding behind a badge." The recess ended, and the courtroom filled once more. Tim took his place, no longer defiant, but resigned. The judge addressed the court, her expression grave. "It is clear that the actions taken by Officer Collins were not only a violation of protocol but a violation of the trust this community places in its law enforcement. The evidence presented here today shows a pattern of abuse, and it is my duty to ensure that justice is served." As she continued, outlining the next steps in the legal process, Malik listened, but his mind was already elsewhere. He had come here for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been made to feel small and powerless. And today, he had seen the start of that justice. The judge's final words echoed through the room. This court will proceed with formal charges against Officer Tim Collins, and we will ensure a thorough investigation of all related incidents. The gavel struck, and the session was adjourned. As people began to leave, Malik stood still, absorbing the moment. He didn't feel triumphant, but he did feel a sense of closure, a quiet acknowledgement that the fight wasn't over, but it was beginning to move in the right direction. And as he looked around the room, he saw faces, some relieved, some still processing, but all of them watching, waiting. This was not the end. But it was a step. And sometimes, a single step was all it took to start a movement. As the courtroom emptied, Malik stood near the front, watching as people filed out, their conversations a low murmur that echoed through the large hall. Tim was one of the last to leave, escorted by his lawyer, his face pale and drawn. There was no trace of the swagger he had shown earlier in the trial. The weight of the accusations, the testimonies, and the evidence had crushed whatever confidence he had left. For the first time, it seemed like Tim truly understood the gravity of his actions, though whether it was out of genuine remorse or fear of the consequences was still unclear. Malik's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He had wanted to see justice served, to make sure that someone who had abused his power would be held accountable. And yet, as he watched Tim walk away, shoulders slumped, a part of him felt something unexpected, pity. Tim had brought this on himself, but the look in his eyes as he left the courtroom was not just one of defeat, but of a man realizing, too late, the cost of his actions. Later that day, Malik sat in his office, surrounded by files and documents, but unable to focus on anything. The phone rang, startling him out of his thoughts. It was Alex. "How are you holding up?" Alex's voice was warm, concerned. "I saw the news. It's all over the place now." Malik leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. "I don't know how to feel, Alex. We did what we needed to do, and yet, it doesn't feel like a victory." Alex sighed on the other end. "That's because there's no real winning in situations like these, Malik. Justice isn't about making someone else lose. It's about trying to set things right, even if the damage can't be completely undone." "I know," Malik said softly. "But seeing him like that, knowing that this could have been avoided, it makes me wonder if there was a moment where things could have been different." Alex paused, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe. But Tim made his choices. And those choices hurt a lot of people. This isn't just about punishing him, it's about making sure that kind of behavior doesn't keep happening. You stood up, and you made sure people listened. That matters." Malik nodded, though the uncertainty still lingered. After a few more moments of silence, they said their goodbyes, and Malik hung up, lost in thought. As the week went on, the case against Tim continued to unfold. More witnesses came forward, not just about Tim, but about other incidents within the department. It was as if Malik's case had opened a floodgate, giving others the courage to speak out. Investigations were launched, not just into Tim's behavior, but into the practices that had allowed him to operate without consequence for so long. What began as a single act of defiance had grown into something much larger, threatening to expose deep-seated issues within the police force. This was where the dilemma began to take shape. Malik had fought for accountability, for transparency, and now it was happening. But the more the investigation uncovered, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about one officer, it was about a system that had allowed and, in some ways, encouraged behavior like Tim's to persist. The ramifications were enormous, and Malik found himself at the center of it all, a reluctant figurehead for a movement he hadn't intended to lead. One evening, Malik received an unexpected visitor. It was Tim's lawyer, Robert Fields, a man known for his sharp mind and even sharper tongue. Malik wasn't sure what to expect, but he invited him in, offering a seat. Judge Thompson, Robert began, his tone formal, but not unfriendly. I know this is unusual, but I wanted to speak with you directly. Off the record. Malik raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What's on your mind, Mr. Fields? Robert hesitated, as if searching for the right approach. He's in a bad place. He knows he's made mistakes, and he's willing to face the consequences. But the investigation is getting out of hand. They're looking to make an example out of him, and it's going to destroy his life completely. Malik's expression remained neutral, but inside, he could feel his frustration rising. With all due respect, Mr. Fields, Tim made an example of himself. He used his position to intimidate and harm people. This investigation is about more than just him. I understand that, Robert said quickly. And I'm not here to make excuses for him. But what if there's a way to resolve this without everything falling apart? If Tim pleads guilty, accepts a reasonable sentence, could we agree to let the broader investigation go? Focus on him, but not drag the entire department into this mess. Malik's eyes narrowed. You're asking me to let the department off the hook? To ignore the fact that this is a systemic problem? I'm asking you to consider the fallout, Robert replied, leaning forward, his voice earnest. If this investigation continues, it will tear the department apart. Maybe that's what it needs, but think about the consequences. There will be backlash, loss of trust, and it could set back community relations for years. We can't afford that kind of division. For a long moment, Malik said nothing. This was the moral dilemma he had been dreading. He had started this fight because of what happened to him, but now it was bigger than him. It wasn't just about Tim anymore, it was about a system that needed to be held accountable. But if pushing forward meant tearing down everything, was it really worth it? I'm not saying we sweep it under the rug, Robert continued, sensing Malik's hesitation. Tim takes responsibility, serves time, and we move on. The department can implement reforms without a public spectacle. Isn't that a better outcome? Malik stood up, walking over to the window and looking out at the city, the lights flickering against the dark sky. You're asking me to compromise, he said quietly, more to himself than to Robert. To settle for less than what's right, because it's easier. I'm asking you to be practical, Robert said, his voice soft but insistent. Sometimes, that's the best we can do. The words hung in the air, and Malik could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. It would be so easy to agree, to end it here, to accept a solution that felt clean and manageable. But it would also mean letting a system off the hook, allowing it to continue as if nothing had changed. I appreciate you coming to me, Mr. Fields, Malik said finally, turning to face him. But this isn't just about Tim. It's about everyone who's been hurt by people like him. I can't ignore that. If the department needs to be torn down and rebuilt, then maybe that's what needs to happen. Robert's expression tightened, but he didn't push further. He could see that Malik's mind was made up. I understand, he said, standing up. For what it's worth, I respect your integrity. I just hope you're ready for what comes next. As Robert left, Malik felt a strange sense of calm. He knew the path ahead would be difficult, that there would be resistance, backlash, and possibly even failure. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path, even if it was the harder one. The days that followed were a whirlwind of media coverage, protests, and heated debates. The community was divided, some supported the investigation, demanding accountability, while others feared it would only deepen the rift between the police and the people they were meant to serve. Malik found himself thrust into the spotlight, a role he had never sought but now had to embrace. One evening, as he was preparing to leave the courthouse, he saw Tim waiting near the entrance, leaning against a pillar, looking lost. Malik hesitated, then walked over, unsure of what to say. Tim looked up, his eyes hollow, the fight gone from his expression. I wanted to see you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I needed to. I don't know. Apologize, I guess. Malik felt a pang of sympathy, but he kept his tone steady. Apology isn't enough, Tim. Not for what you've done. I know, Tim said quickly, his hands trembling. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was in control, but I was just scared, I guess. Scared of losing everything, scared of being seen as weak. Malik shook his head, feeling a mix of sadness and frustration. Being scared doesn't excuse what you did. You had a choice, every time, and you chose wrong. Tim's eyes glistened with tears, but he didn't look away. So what happens now? They're going to take everything. My job, my future. I don't know how to fix it. Maybe you can't, Malik said, his voice gentle but firm. Maybe you have to live with what you've done, and let that be the lesson. But you can start by accepting responsibility. Real responsibility, not just for the court, but for yourself. Tim nodded slowly, as if the words were sinking in, painfully, but deeply. I'll try, he said, though the uncertainty in his voice was palpable. Good, Malik said, turning to leave. Because this is bigger than you, Tim. It always was. As he walked away, Malik couldn't help but feel the full weight of what was to come. He had chosen a difficult path, one that might not bring easy solutions or clear victories. But for the first time, he felt like they were heading towards something real, something that might lead to change, even if it came at a cost. Weeks passed, and the investigation expanded beyond what anyone had anticipated. As more stories surfaced, the entire city seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what the outcome would be. It became clear that this was no longer just about Tim Collins, it was about an entire system that had been operating under a veil of impunity, a system that was now being pulled into the light. Malik continued to play his part, though he never sought out the spotlight. He was careful, deliberate, and determined, speaking out not just in the courtroom, but in community forums and public discussions, advocating for transparency and reform. For him, this was a chance to make a lasting change, to ensure that what happened to him, and so many others, would not continue unchecked. The day of the final verdict for Tim Collins arrived, and the courtroom was packed once again. This time, there was a sense of finality in the air, a realization that whatever happened next would set a precedent. The judge presiding over Tim's case delivered the verdict, guilty on multiple counts of misconduct and abuse of power. Tim was sentenced to serve time and was stripped of his badge. As the sentence was read, Tim sat quietly, no longer the defiant figure he once was. He had faced his own reflection and found himself lacking, and though he was paying a heavy price, there was a hint of acceptance in his eyes. It was as if he had finally understood that his actions had led him here, and there was no one to blame but himself. Before he was led away, Tim requested to say a few words. There was a hush as he stood, turning to address the court and, for the first time, speaking without any rehearsed defense or bravado. I can't undo what I've done, he said, his voice low, but clear. I know that. But I see now how wrong I was. I hurt people because I thought I had the right to judge them, to control them. And I have to live with that. He paused, looking over at Malik. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope one day I can find a way to make things right, even if it's just by acknowledging what I've done. The words were sincere, and for a brief moment, Malik felt a flicker of something, pity, perhaps, but also a quiet sense of closure. Tim's fall was complete, but it was not without a hint of redemption, a possibility that he could learn from his mistakes, even if it was too late to change his past. As Tim was escorted out, the room's attention turned to Malik, who had become a symbol of resilience and justice throughout the case. Reporters crowded around him, asking what he planned to do next. Malik simply smiled, his answer concise but powerful, this isn't the end. It's a beginning. For all of us. The consequences of the trial rippled across the city. The police department underwent a complete overhaul, with new leadership brought in to enforce reforms. Policies were changed, training programs were revised, and for the first time, there was a real effort to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the community. Malik had played a pivotal role in these changes, working alongside city officials to ensure that the promises made were not just words, but actions. Months later, Malik was back in his neighborhood, walking through the park where he often spent time growing up. It was a sunny day, kids were playing, and there was a sense of normalcy in the air that felt almost surreal after everything that had happened. He sat on a bench, watching the scene unfold, when a familiar face approached him. It was Shonda, the activist who had supported him during the trial. "You did it, Malik," she said, sitting down beside him. "I don't know if you realize how big this is, but you changed things." Malik smiled, a soft, humble expression. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "It took everyone, people like you, those who spoke up, and those who listened. I just helped start the conversation." Shonda nodded, then asked, "What's next for you? Are you going to keep pushing for more change?" Malik looked out at the park, at the city he had fought so hard for, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. "Yes," he said. "There's still work to be done. But I'm not afraid to do it. Not anymore." As we wrap up this story, it's important to take a moment to reflect on everything that happened. What we saw here wasn't just a fight for justice, it was a journey of accountability, courage, and change. Malik stood up, not just for himself, but for every person who had been silenced, intimidated, and overlooked. It's a powerful reminder that change doesn't come from one person, but from many voices coming together, demanding to be heard. But this story also shows us the complexity of justice. For Tim, it wasn't just about facing punishment, it was about facing the truth of who he had become. And while his actions were wrong, his acknowledgement of them was a step toward understanding. It's a hard lesson, but an important one, that real change starts when we are willing to confront the parts of ourselves, and our systems, that are flawed. What did you think of Malik's story? Do you believe that change is truly possible when people like him stand up? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can continue to address these issues in our communities. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of resilience, justice, and unexpected twists, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode, and join us as we continue to explore stories that challenge, inspire, and make you think. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.